All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Carl Miller. I'm a programming director here at the Federalist Society, and it's my honor to introduce our distinguished guest today. Mr. Jordan Lorence is Senior Counsel and Strategic Engagement Director at Alliance Defending Freedom. His litigation work has encompassed a broad variety of areas with a primary focus on religious liberty, free speech, student privacy, the conscience rights of creative professionals, and the First Amendment protections of public university students and professors. Prior to joining ADF in 2001, Jordan was for many years a productive allied attorney, actively involved in significant litigation for ADF. He's also worked for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, Concerned Women for America, and the American Center for Law and Justice. He earned his BA in journalism at Stanford University and his JD from the University of Minnesota Law School. We're also joined by our very own Professor Marianne Case, who is the Arnold I. Shore Professor of Law here at the University of Chicago. A graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School, Professor Case litigated for Paul, Weiss, Rivkin, Wharton, and Garrison, studied at the University of Munich, and was Professor of Law at UVA before joining the faculty here at UChicago Law. Professor Case has been a visiting professor at NYU. She has been a Bosch Public Policy Fellow at the American Academy.
They can read about it. Let's get on to it.
All right. Professor Case is a specialist on religious freedom, and she has done extensive work on the regulation of sexuality and gender and research on feminist history. And without further ado, please welcome our distinguished guest. The format for today is going to be a debate, and I will give hand signals to the speakers at the end of each interview, and then following the debate, we'll have Q&A from the audience. Thank you all, and please give a warm Illinois welcome to Mr. Lorence and Professor Case.
Let me just say that I don't do spicy food very well, and so my coughing is my reacting, and I may take my napkin here. If I blow my nose, it's
Let me
just...
say you call this spicy food.
That's how bad I am when it comes to, exactly. And then I just want to also tout one of my greatest credentials that didn't get mentioned, that I was a contestant on Jeopardy. And if you're ever, I came in third place. And this is my, if ever you do Jeopardy, this is my one point that I just want to make. It's kind of an extra bonus track to this talk. You got to be smart, obviously, but the key to winning is the thumb speed, because they don't activate the buzzers until, well, it was, in my time, it was Alex Trebek and whoever the host is now, until they're done giving the answer. So like, if you see the category and you think, oh, I know the answer to that, and you try to buzz in early and gamble that you'll know the answer, you'll lock yourself out. So you really have to listen to the question. And then there's this split-second thumb race. And I wish I would have been, I don't know, doing, thumb dexterity things too. But that's what killed me. So anyway, piece of advice about being on Jeopardy. I have litigated religious liberty cases for a long time. And one of the, the big nemesis that we would have in our battles would be the Establishment Clause as defined by the Lemon Test. And last summer, in the Supreme Court's decision in the Coach Kennedy, the praying football coach case, the most important thing they did in that decision was they formally announced that they were abandoning the Lemon Test. And I say good riddance. And I want to explain, at least from my perspective, it's not going to be exhaustive on every kind of issue possible that comes up under the Establishment Clause. But this is where I think the Supreme Court was right. I just want to make 2 points. That the three-part Lemon Test in Lemon v. Kurtzman from 1971 was not based on a historical understanding of what state-established churches did to advance their predominance and their prevailing orthodoxy. So it was ahistorical in that many government officials took the commands of the Lemon Test to mean we have to go on a search and destroy mission for all private religious expression. That it was somehow, a negative thing. It was religion in public life. No, even if it's coming out of the mouth of private parties, it's toxic. It's like asbestos in the ceiling tiles, and we have to get rid of it. We have to eradicate it. So, going back to a more historical model, I think, is the proper way to go. So what is the Lemon Test? It was a case in 1971, and the Supreme Court tried to have a sort of a cover the entire universe, of like every Establishment Clause situation. You can think of it was like a Ten Commandments monument. It was government aid. If it was whatever it was, it would all be covered by the Lemon Test. So they had this three-part test, and when there was a challenge that whatever the government was doing, that it violated the Establishment Clause under the Lemon Test, the government action had to pass all three of these. If it failed one of them, it would violate the Establishment Clause. So the government action had to have a secular purpose. That was the first prong. The second prong, it could not have a primary effect of promoting or disparaging religion, and it could not excessively entangle the government in religion. And the Supreme Court, as the years went on from 1971, began to see this was unworkable. And where one of the more prominent announcements of how unworkable it was Justice Scalia's colorful opinion in Lamb's Chapel, where he likened the Lemon Test to a monstrous zombie, like from The Walking Dead. Although he called it a ghoul, so when you hear his description, he's describing what we would call a zombie. And I just want to read, just because it's so colorful. As to the court's invocation of the Lemon Test, like some ghoul, read zombie, in a late-night horror movie that repeatedly sits up in its grave and shuffles abroad after being repeatedly killed and buried, Lemon stalks our Establishment Clause jurisprudence once again, frightening little children and school board attorneys. And he goes on, and he basically explains how the court was being disingenuous and sometimes using it, and then other times just ignoring it to decide a case. And in fact, I counted since 1993, so this was the Lamb's Chapel decision, and that was 20 years after, more than 20 years after Lemon came into effect. The Supreme Court has had 11 Establishment Clause cases where it totally ignored the Lemon Test. So you could see there was something they were adverse to in it. And what they replaced the Lemon Test was, that they said in the Coach Kennedy case, was this referring to historical practices and understandings, that was going to be the test now. Was there and I think that this is a good test, at least to I'm optimistic as the courts work it out, because people at the time that the First Amendment was drafted in 1789 had a practical, real-life experience with state-established churches. They had them in Europe. 9 of the 13 states, former colonies, had state-established churches, and they would do certain things to establish their orthodoxy. And I just want to run through these quickly. Mike McConnell, used to be a 10th Circuit judge and is a law professor out at Stanford, wrote a very important law review article.
He used to be a law professor here.
Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. Yes. So do you know him, by the way?
Yes.
Oh yeah. So he's a great guy, and he wrote in this article that, because you think about it, like, well, what did state-established churches do? And he identified, and the article is very interesting. He goes through a lot more historical depth than I'm going to right here to say this is how state-established churches operated. They would compel attendance, that people had to go to the state-established churches' church services or be punished. And these all had formal punishments, this type of thing. They regulated the doctrine and personnel of the state-established church. they gave direct financial aid for the mission of the church, not some other purpose that, where the churches was just one of many beneficiaries. They would just give direct, for building their buildings, paying their pastors, paying for their operating costs. They prohibited worship in dissenting churches, read, non-established churches. You could not worship in those. If the preachers were out preaching, they had to have a license from the state church. Patrick Henry, one of his claims to fame was that he would defend Baptist churches that would preach on hillsides in Virginia because the Anglican Church was the state church and they wouldn't give them preacher licenses. They would have restrictions on political participation by members of dissenting churches in the government. They were excluded. And also, they would use the established churches to carry out civil functions. Now, to show, the Lemon Test basically has none of this in mind when it came out. And there's sort of this ahistorical vacuum that it floats in. And the Supreme Court confronted this in the case of Marsh v. Chambers. And it was kind of embarrassing. So there was a challenge to the Nebraska legislature's practice of having a paid chaplain open every legislative session with prayer. Bow your heads and we're going to pray that, as we debate this workers' comp bill or whatever, and they would pray. And one of the senators, they have a unicameral legislature, they call it the Senate. One of the senators challenged this, Ernie Chambers, challenged this as violating the Establishment Clause. Now, if you run through the three prongs of the Lemon Test, well, is there a secular purpose to prayer? Well, maybe they're solemnizing the event, but, it looks pretty bad. And they're paying this chaplain. He's got a formal position with the legislature. What's the primary effect? Well, it looks like it's advancing religion, so it fails the second prong, first and second prong. Maybe you can make even an argument for excessive entanglement. But all you need is to fail one, and you're violate the Establishment Clause. So, what did the Supreme Court do? They upheld the practice by a 6-3 vote, even though there was this, clearly it was at odds with the Lemon Test. Why did they do that? The Supreme Court wrote, on September 25th, 1789, 3 days after Congress authorized the appointment of paid chaplains, final agreement was reached on the language of the Bill of Rights. So in other words, they set up the paid chaplaincy and then 3 days later passed the final language that we have in our Constitution now as the Establishment Clause. Clearly, the men who wrote the First Amendment religion clauses did not view paid legislative chaplains and opening prayers as a violation of the amendment, and because the practice has gone on. And they were just basically too embarrassed to say, yeah, what do those guys know who wrote the First Amendment? This is clearly unconstitutional on our newly minted Lemon Test that's almost 200 years after the fact of the writing of it. But this did not cause the Supreme Court to revert to a history and tradition test that they that they now have embraced. But sort of this weird kind of, sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't, that sort of thing. And I wanted to just share from my perspective what I think was one of the greatest problems with the Lemon Test. And that is, it sent a message to government officials that they had to go on a search and destroy mission for any religious expression, even if it was private, and expunge it from public life. So this became a big issue in the 1970s and into the 1980s. That if, for example, if you had a government space, like an auditorium at a public school or wherever, a city hall, and they would allow private individuals to use it, for some, a labor union or some sort of private association or whatever. What about a religious group using it? And some of the courts would say yes, some of the courts would say no. There was a big case in Arizona, just to give you an example, that Billy Graham, the evangelist, wanted to rent Sun Devil Stadium at the University at Arizona State. And somebody brought a lawsuit and said, well, this must violate the Establishment Clause. And the Arizona Supreme Court said, well, no, this is, we rent it out to everybody and we don't endorse the views that we have there. But there were courts that said the opposite, that the Establishment Clause under the Lemon Test imposed a duty to exclude. There was one case from the Second Circuit decided in 1981 where they said a student-led Bible study in a public school was something too dangerous to permit. So it had that sort of, religion as hazardous waste, we have to exclude it. Now the Supreme Court in 1981 had a case, Widmar v. Vincent, where they said, look, when you view these access to forum cases, you view them fundamentally as a freedom of speech case, not as an Establishment Clause case, because the government does not endorse the views of the religious group or any private group that's meeting there. This involved a student group at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. But weirdly, it took up until last year, and I'm not even sure we're done with this, the Supreme Court has spoken to this issue 6 times since 1981 and said, government officials, we remind you once again, you have no duty. The Establishment Clause does not impose a duty on you to treat religious groups that are private differently than anybody else. And it's this kind of legacy of the Lemon Test, I think. It kind of reminds me of after World War II ended in 1945, there was about 10, 15 years where you would read in the news where there was some Japanese soldier or group of soldiers on an island, obscure island in the Pacific, and they thought World War II was still going on, and they would be, sabotaging things. And then what they would usually do is they would bring in the retired commanding officer on a megaphone, the war is over, Japan lost, you can come out of the jungle now. And I feel like the Supreme Court has kind of been doing that. There's not an Establishment Clause problem, local units of government. Now, to show you how deeply ingrained this is and the permeation of this, the Supreme Court addressed this just last term in the Shurtleff versus City of Boston case with the flagpoles about they were running up flags of the community groups wanted. And then when some guy wanted to put up, a group wanted to put up a Christian flag that had a red cross on it, they said, no, that would violate the Establishment Clause. And what they would do is they would use this gloss on the Lemon Test that I didn't mention of the reasonable observer. So this became the 3 parts of the Lemon Test kind of got collapsed down to this notion about the reasonable observer. And what I call it is that does this look bad test. So and I just want to give you a thought. This wasn't a real case, but I just want to give you a thought experiment. New York City has Central Park. It's one of the major attractions and parts of New York City, and I just think whoever figured out to set aside all that land in the center of Manhattan was extremely wise. And there's many musicians that have put on concerts there or other big rallies. So Taylor Swift has had a big concert there, Simon and Garfunkel, the Dave Matthews Band. And if somebody said, does New York City endorse the views of Taylor Swift? They would say, well, I don't know, I really thought about that. And no, it's just sort of like an empty space that, if they pay the money and do whatever they have to do, putting up porta potties or whatever, and that's okay. But Pope John Paul II, when he was Pope, held Mass there in the same place, same park, and you're thinking here's the head of the Roman Catholic Church engaging in the central ritual of the Roman Catholic Church, and wow, this really kind of looks bad. And now there wasn't a lawsuit. There were other lawsuits in other cities where the Pope would do that because they were using this reasonable observer test to say, this looks bad. Now I have to read to you, the Sixth Circuit had one of these cases dealing with the menorah at a city hall in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And they wrote about, this was kind of a play on the heckler's veto, they called it the ignoramus's veto. And this is what the reasonable observer turned into. The ignoramus's veto lies in the hands of those determined to see an endorsement of religion, even though a reasonable person and any minimally informed person knows that no endorsement is intended or conveyed by adherence to the traditional public forum doctrine. The plaintiffs posit a reasonable observer who knows nothing about the nature of the exhibit. He simply sees a religious object in a prominent public place and ignorantly assumes that the government is endorsing it. We refuse to rest important constitutional doctrines on such unrealistic legal fictions. Now, this was in 1992, but the city of Boston in the Shurtleff case just last term basically made the exact same argument. We got 3 flagpoles in front of City Hall, you know, and when we're flying the Chinese flag, you know, people aren't going to think, oh, you endorse the the locking up of the Uyghur people. You know, the city of Boston is endorsing the policies of the Chinese government. They would say, you know, there's something else going on. It would usually because there was like a Chinese festival going on somewhere in Boston. But the Christian flag, somebody walks by, they're going to think the city of Boston is endorsing Christianity. And the Supreme Court, you know, you would think, like Boston is in some hick town, they probably have some well-paid lawyers, but you know, they probably went to Harvard, so maybe that's the, but anyway. But you get the idea that they still made the argument that a reasonable observer would see this and think it was an endorsement of religion and would violate the Lemon Test. And this is something constantly in my litigation I was dealing with, and I think it was this legacy from the Lemon Test that needs to be amended. Now, there's a lot of other things that we could talk about, and you know, like what's this going to look like going forward? There's a lot of other things that the Establishment Clause does, but I really feel that this has been a good riddance. And I want to end with this comment that Justice Brennan wrote in McDaniel v. Patty, which was a case in 1978 where they invalidated a provision of the Tennessee Constitution that categorically forbade pastors and priests to be state legislators. And again, I think it has this, it's part of that. Religion is a toxic waste. It's a hazardous waste that we have to exclude from public life. And the Supreme Court struck that down as violating various First Amendment provisions. And Justice Brennan wrote these insightful words in his concurring opinion. The Establishment Clause does not license government to treat religion and those who teach or practice it simply by virtue of their status as such, as subversive of American ideals and therefore subject to unique disabilities. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from Professor Keys.
So thanks a lot. I am not here principally to defend the Lemon Test. I like the Lemon Test, but I agree that it is a creature of its time, a time in which all of those of you who have taken any constitutional law course will know the court was looking for 3- and 4-part tests that don't really have the quality of a test, but are trying to get at what the court thinks are of importance. Again, if there's going to be a test, I think, and I have not heard actually that much to the contrary from Mr. Lorence, that Lemon captures what one might be interested in looking at. I've only got 15 minutes though, so I'm mainly going to talk about what the test is now and should be going forward, and how little in the way of good guidance I heard from Mr. Lorence, who, again, I'm trying to figure out what this court is doing. It's not doing what I would do, but I'm trying to listen to them when they talk to me. And I hear a lot about textualism, and I hear a lot about originalism, and originalism isn't original intent, originalism is original public meaning. That's not what I heard from you or what I'm hearing from the court. I'm hearing about history and tradition. Now, history and tradition is not original public meaning, it's not original intent, it's certainly not textualism. So I want to talk about what the difference is between those two. I hope you noticed that almost every one of Mr. Jordan's examples, I think everyone, involved the states. It did not involve the federal government, let alone Congress. And I hope you all can recite with me the beginning text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law doing what? Respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, okay? If you are talking about original intent, I think there is no dispute. I don't think I'm going to get one from Mr. Lorence. Certainly I won't get from Professor McConnell, for example, that the original intent, the original public understanding of the Establishment Clause was that a federal government of limited and enumerated powers simply had no power over religion. And what the original Establishment Clause was designed to do was to allow the states to do as they pleased with respect to the establishment of religion. Now, Mr. Lorence has given some examples of what the states that chose to establish a religion chose to do. Not all the states chose to establish a religion, and there were many diverse forms of establishment between and among them. In any event, there is no dispute that until at least the time of the post-Civil War amendments, the states were free to do as they please when it came to establishment, including rooting out religion from any aspect of their public life they pleased. What remains, I think, profoundly unresolved in terms of the methodologies the current court is pressing upon us is whether that changed and when and how. I have interesting fellow travelers with me on this course. Famously, Justice Thomas has been saying consistently from the get-go that it's simply incoherent to incorporate the Establishment Clause against the states. I think there's a lot to be said for that position.
Yeah.
I think it is also not entirely clear even whether, let alone how, the Free Exercise Clause has been incorporated against the states. I was quite interested to hear Justice Kavanaugh say at a Supreme Court oral argument in early December 2021, I think the other side would say the core problem here is the court has been forced by the position you're taking and by the cases to pick sides on the most contentious social debate in American life, and to do so in a situation where they say the Constitution is neutral on the question. And I think they also then continue, because the Constitution is neutral, that this court should be scrupulously neutral on the question. Because the Constitution doesn't give us the authority, we should leave it to the states, and we should be scrupulously neutral on the question. Now, I'm sure many of you know that the oral argument question was that of Dobbs and the question was that of abortion. My view is that Kavanaugh would have been much more correct if he'd said exactly the same thing a week later in the oral argument of Carson v. Macon, when the question was whether an unwilling state had to subsidize a pervasively sectarian school as a public school. So a lot of the debate in the original framing was about state diversity when it came to establishment, when it came to religion. And I know that we heard quotes from Mr. Lorence about what the various state constitutions provided, and claims by Michael McConnell that that should give us some information about what the federal Constitution provided. I don't see how that happens. I do not think that there is a good claim that it happens through the Due Process Clause. This court led by Clarence Thomas, has called into question substantive due process. He's the one who says, let's root it out, root and branch. There's a possibility that you could achieve much the same effect under privileges and immunities in the 14th Amendment. That is something that has yet to be worked out by anyone, including Clarence Thomas, since the subject is religion. I'll ask the question I always ask of proponents of this means of incorporating religious protections against the state. Are they seriously telling me that the Pope, that Pope Francis, that Archbishop Vigano, if you don't like Pope Francis, have no free exercise rights the moment they land in these United States because none of them are citizens? So I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I am baffled why the court does not answer Mr. Lorence. I mean, I understand why he's not answering in this way. He's an advocate, and he's got to do what works before the people who can make it work. But I don't understand why the court is not applying the methodologies it applies in all the other areas, allegedly, to the area of religion. So let's talk about the text. Let's talk about prohibition being something stronger than abridgment, which is what speech gets. And I invite examples of where free exercise is actually prohibited rather than abridged. Now, I hear John Lorence saying, Mr. Coach Kennedy, he was prohibiting. I always liken these occasions to not focus so much on American scripture as on the scripture of more worth to people of faith. And I'll say, forget about what the school board was telling Coach Kennedy. You should have been listening to what Jesus was telling you. And I'll end with Matthew 6. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love praying standing in the synagogues and on the street corner to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. And when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep babbling on like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them. So I would say to Judge Kennedy, nothing stopped him from praying. He demanded to pray contrary to his employer's wishes and contrary to the wishes of his chosen Redeemer, publicly and loudly. And for that, I think his employers and the state who paid them should have been able to sanction him.
Yeah, I love Professor Case, and she always puts me through my paces, and this is not the first time we've debated, and I really feel that you benefit from having, so I have to respond to that, and she raises some very good points. So I just want to say I agree. As an advocate, I have to take the law as it is. Okay, the law says that the First Amendment has been incorporated against the states, and that's how I have to argue it. I am aware of what Clarence Thomas has said, and we never said, hey, the state should just be free to ignore the First Amendment because we can use the First Amendment law. I do think it would be interesting, and I just want to say that as it's an intriguing thought, and I'm not an expert in this, but that if the Supreme Court said the incorporation doctrine is total bunk, and nothing of the First Amendment or maybe some of the other provisions of the Bill of Rights of the first 8 amendments have been incorporated against the states, we would see, I think, what the litigation strategy would shift to litigate these things under the federal under each individual state constitution, because they all have free speech clauses, free exercise clauses. Sometimes they're like right of conscience, they're a little bit more robust than the free exercise clause. And we would definitely have a very, different, variegated selection of doctrines of how the states were doing that. And again, I'm no expert on was the incorporation doctrine right or wrong, or was it really should be under the Privileges or Immunities Clause and not under substantive due process? I just don't know enough to speak to that, and probably other professors are. But that would have been something that I would not have said, oh, that's just a terrible environment for us to be in, where we have to, like, you know, depending on the state, we have to learn all this case law and litigate it uniquely under their state constitution. I think that would be okay if we were to do that. I am not that familiar with with all the details of the Coach Kennedy case, so I just want to focus on the big doctrinal move that they did. But I do want to comment on the scripture that you're reading. And I just love it when the words of Jesus are brought up in these things. I think, and now this is more of a matter, like Jesus also said, don't trumpet, sound the trumpets when you're giving alms to the poor. He wasn't saying only give, you have to go hide somewhere to give your alms to the poor. I think it was more the attitude of the heart of like, are you impressed with me? I'm giving away money to poor people. I'm praying. Aren't you impressed that I'm praying? Because then it would be that any time somebody was praying in public, it reduces it to sort of an external, thing, like a mechanical thing. And I don't think that's who he was getting at. So Coach Kennedy has his own religious convictions that he was doing that. I'm not sure I would do the same thing of praying on the field, but I do think that it's something that's protected and that Jesus did not absolutely prohibit. So those are my comments. And so if you want to respond or we can take questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, we've got time for a couple rebuttals.
Oh, can I just say one other thing too?
Yes.
I think the history test, I forgot one other thing that you said. What I was trying to make, and I guess I didn't do it very well, I think what they're capsulizing, those 6 categories that Mike McConnell did, is it just like history and tradition, and it's just sort of like just floating around in a sprawling way without boundaries. I think that if there is a test, it would be something like this. And I admit that this wasn't, but that the government has to be using its formal mechanisms of coercion, like, fining people, jailing them, disqualifying them from offices or something like that. There has to be that element in there before, as well as religion, before it violates the Establishment Clause. I also think that direct funding of a religious group for its religious mission would also violate that history and tradition test. And what would not violate it is, we have a fire department here in Chicago, and when the Buddhist monastery catches on fire, the fire department is allowed to put it out, and it's not direct aid in violation of the federal Establishment Clause if it applies to the states, which the Supreme Court says it does, because they put out every fire that goes on. So that's what I think would be the test, something like that.
I mean, if we're going to debate the tests, and I'm happy to do that, then I wonder how you feel about the various recent mandatory aid cases, which are not analogous, in my view, to putting out fires, because they are, some of them, available on a competitive basis only. It is not the case that every fire, it's like the fire department saying, okay, we've got 5 burning buildings, we're gonna choose to put out 1. How are we gonna decide to choose which one to put out? That you have to agree is a different situation.
Yes.
That is the situation of Trinity Lutheran, where the money is given to a church and it's not given to other people. Also, the recent cases, again, Carson v. Macon is the one that I said
Right.
should have been treated with deference to the state's choice, not to fund. They didn't even say we're gonna make the difference religious status versus non-religious status. They said we're gonna make the difference. You cannot be qualified as public school if you are pervasively sectarian. And so the series of cases from Trinity Lutheran to Espinoza v. Montana, which says that even if no one gets funded, the fact that the state stepped out of funding so that it didn't have to discriminate between religious and non-religious potential recipients, even that is a discrimination against religion, and the state now has to fund where it didn't want to fund at all. And Carson v. Macon, the state has to fund again, where it doesn't want to fund at all.
Yeah, and in Montana, they wanted to fund them, and in Maine, in Carson, did not want to fund them. That
Right.
would,
Yes.
so.
And again, if we are going to let there be federalist variety among the approaches of the several states, then that might turn out to be a result. Some states may want to fund and other states may not want to fund. A supermajority of states have in their constitution some just one and some two constitutional provisions saying we do not give money to churches or to pervasively sectarian schools. A federalist view, consistent with the original public meaning of the First Amendment, would defer to those states' choices.
This is, and again, we have the whole incorporation doctrine, which allowed us to bring the free exercise. What I find that there's some, I want to talk about Carson and just the whole concept, like the Trinity Lutheran, where I think that there's some big problems with the way if the states try to enforce that. Frequently those Blaine amendments, the super strict establishment clause or no government funding, will say direct or indirect aid. And if you bring up the thing like, well, can you plow the snow off the streets in front of the evangelical church? Can the detectives go and investigate a burglary at the Buddhist monastery? Can they put out a fire at the Jewish synagogue? That they have to come up with some, because to me that's indirect aid to religion. And they have to come up with some sort of, well, yeah, but that's like random and like everybody benefits from it. And I feel like they kind of give away the store with that kind of an argument, that they're saying if there's some general benefit. So in Trinity Lutheran, the issue was they wanted to recycle tires out of the landfills and put these playground surfaces in. So they had these neutral criteria for nonprofit groups to qualify. Trinity Lutheran qualified, and they said, oh wait, we have this provision.
One of the neutral criteria was don't be a church. Trinity Lutheran's application should not have gotten into the stage of being considered. It's like, someone from Chicago applies and saying, give me the local money for playground funding because, the law students are bumping their heads on the pavement outside the law school, right? Somebody who saw that application should have said, sorry, no point going further to see where it ranks. It's ineligible.
Yeah, I understand your point, but to me, if they said, we're going to do the playground, like everybody but Lutherans, or anybody but religious people or religious institutions could get that because of our state constitutional provision, to me, that is not a neutral criteria that anybody can qualify for. Because they're singling out nonprofit groups that are religious and treating them differently in a way that just seems, I think would strike most people as discriminatory.
Every limiting criteria is discriminatory, almost by definition. That's its point, to discriminate, to distinguish between the eligible and the ineligible.
But like one of the criteria was that they had in Missouri was, do you allow the neighborhood kids to play on the playground, or is it exclusive for the kids that you don't like if it's a daycare center or something like that? And some would say, no, it's just exclusive, and they would get lesser points or fewer points. And then the ones that were open to the public, which Trinity Lutheran went, so they got extra points, and they had something like 44 applicants, and I think they picked 14 of them. And see, those seem more neutral because they're not like, well, what's your group about?
So
what's
honestly,
the identity?
it doesn't seem neutral. It seems like it risks discrimination between and among religions. Proselytizing religions will do better because they may be more open to strangers. Religions that have a fixed set of faithful whom they don't want to have contaminated with contact with others may do badly. It's one of the concerns of the Establishment Clause that once you start giving aid to religion, it's hard to not privilege some over others, even through the use of what you are calling neutral criteria, because different religions are differently situated with respect to these criteria. These are some of the older cases about establishment.
Right.
If you frame various rules such that more established religions do better, religions that get their money from their faithful do better than religions who solicit money from outsiders. All of these problems that present not just the appearance of discrimination, but the reality of discrimination, I think is what the mid-20th century establishment clause jurisprudence is trying to avoid.
Yeah, I want, because we have limited, I want to, on the Carson case, we do have the kind of a different scenario where the state does not want to fund the religious groups, and they've set this up. But what I felt was problematic about what the state of Maine said is that these private Christian schools, I don't want the exact words, but under the criteria of the state compulsory attendance law, they're allowed to operate. They're not like renegade schools where, something like that.
That's because of another substantive due process case, and if the court is now going to set its face against substantive due process, among the cases that have very little to stand on are Pierce v. Society of Sisters and Meyer v. Nebraska. That's why states do not try and shut down private religious education, because, among other things, they think the Supreme Court has prevented them from doing so.
But I believe the two, and those cases are important, and I like them and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think I don't think the state of Maine was saying, we would like to shut down all the private education institutions, schools in the state, except for that darn, Meyer v. Nebraska and Pierce v. Society of Sisters, that they said, you can operate as a private school if you meet these criteria. Oh, but wait, when we're giving money, we're going to, even though only to some of those schools and not to others, and it depends on what you're teaching.
So, we're going to get really deep into the weeds of Carson v. Macon, and that probably is not what the people here want to hear about. But the difference with the Maine program is it wasn't giving general aid to schools that they approved of. It was only in those districts where there wasn't enough population to justify a public school. This was taking the place of a public school.
Yes.
And it was supposed to provide a public education. That's different from even the Montana case, where it's a subsidy more generally to private schooling.
Right.
But anyway, I think that's, we can talk further about this, but I think at this point.
Well, maybe we should have some Q&A.
Yeah, this has been an awesome discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Case and Mr. Lorence. We have time for a few questions if any audience members have questions. Yes, Courtney?
Yeah, this is mainly for Professor Case. I was just curious what your opinion is on Thomas v. Review Board and whether that was right, because you were talking about how maybe we should look to like Coach Kennedy's underlying religion. And Thomas v. Review Board, the court was basically like, look, even if this guy has kind of idiosyncratic beliefs and even if he disagrees with other religious adherents, like as long as he's sincere, we're not really going to scrutinize it more. Do you think that approach is
I was not making a constitutional law argument against Coach Kennedy. I was honestly trying to understand where Coach Kennedy is coming from, and I don't get it. I understand where Thomas is coming from.
Okay.
And I do not, what is Coach Kennedy trying to do? And partly what he's trying to do does affect how the courts should respond to him. My sense is that there was good evidence that one of the things he was trying to do was proselytize. But, and one of the things that strikes me as prima facie evidence of that is that he insisted on praying loudly and publicly when he could have said his prayers and no one would have been the wiser. No one was chasing him off the field. If he had prayed in strict accordance with Jesus' recommendations in the Gospel of Matthew, no one would have known.
The one thought that I want to offer just to and this doesn't speak so much to Thomas v. Review Board, but that I think we have to think about this and make sure there's a couple assumptions that we're not, like, let's say that Coach let's just assume, because I think the people who worked on the case would dispute whether he was proselytized, but let's just say that he is.
No, again, I'm just trying to understand what's in his head based on what's coming
Yeah,
out of
and
his mouth.
sometimes people, like, I have to thank God right after the game, and, and I don't know if I would necessarily do that if I was a football coach, but, I cut people slack. But I think we've got to be careful not to assume teachers never proselytize unless they're religious and then they do it with great frequency. And so, like, I can think of a scenario, for example, if there was a teacher who served in the National Guard and said, oh man, I look kind of bleary-eyed here on Monday morning because I had my weekend maneuvers and we were shooting guns and training Ukrainians on how to use the artillery against the Russians, and I used to be in the Marines, and Semper Fi, and I have a poster up, and I urge you kids to be in ROTC. And I can see where pacifist students would say, oh man, I feel kind of like in an alien environment here because I don't agree with any of that. And I don't think the answer can be, and I realize as a legal matter, would that violate the Establishment Clause? No, it wouldn't, because it's not religious. But I think it's ignoring the forest for the trees to say, well, that would be okay. Suck it up, pacifist student. You have a pro-military teacher, and you may have to kind of, say, defeating the Nazis was good on your final exam if you don't want to get an F or something like that. And I think that exactly how you accommodate those students or whatever, I just think it's a myth to think there's some sort of neutral, values-neutral teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic way. And if we just get rid of religion, then that's all we have in a public school, and that's okay. So that's the one thing that I would add to this that I feel is like Coach Kennedy, even if you view him as a surreptitious evangelist and a culprit, he's not the only kind of teacher that does that kind of stuff. And what do we do about that?
Yes, backside. Oh, yeah.
So kind of going to the incorporation doctrine, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not too familiar, but I feel like in the Second Amendment history and tradition test, it seems like they look to when the 14th Amendment was ratified. And just based on sort of what you've been mentioning today with McConnell, it sounds like a lot of what he's looking at is sort of the founding era versus the 14th Amendment ratification era, even though it's still the history and tradition test. Do you see a conflict?
I have a little bit to say, and I just want to say that I am no expert on the incorporation doctrine. But I think that the argument is, I think it was like by 1820, all the states had eliminated their state established churches. So if you're going to incorporate the Establishment Clause, which I do think it's an interesting question that Clarence Thomas raises, that it was just a ban on a federal state church, and that the states were allowed to have their own established churches. But I think what they did was, like, people, it wasn't an abstraction to them. Like, well, what do they do? Well, they do these certain things that he listed. And so that if you're looking for the relevant historical data, you have to go back to the First Amendment times when there were state established churches, and what did they do that Congress was trying to outlaw with the First Amendment.
But then you don't mention the classic example that is also original intent as well as original public understanding, Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which says that it is a problem, that it should be outlawed to require even threepence to be
Yes.
Provided to religious schools, even when the non-religious have a choice of giving it to any institution of higher learning, even a non-religious.
Yeah, you're right. What was
So
it?
if
Patrick Henry he was trying to say, yeah, if you picked one that you liked, then you don't have a conscientious
And
objection.
it wasn't just that if you picked one that you liked, there was a secular alternative. You'd have to say, I do not like education, right?
Yeah.
I do not like libraries, I do not like schools. It wasn't just being neutral among religions or giving a choice among religions. It also provided a non-religious choice, and Madison said, doesn't matter, still a problem.
Well, and the one thing that I would say is that this was a program of direct funding of religious, teachers that I think is categorically unlike like the Trinity Lutheran kind of situation, and even the school choice programs that state legislatures that want to do them set up, that they have that circuit breaker of the independent parental choice directing where the funds go. And I just think that that's different than the remonstrance language.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, Joe?
Thank you both for speaking. Especially Mr. Lawrence. As a formalist, I'll verge more into what would probably be a prudential point about getting rid of the lemon test and adjusting our establishment jurisprudence is. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on concerns, and I think that these are the sort of concerns that were raised by Justice Frankfurter in his Barnett dissent about courts and the power of courts necessarily getting into the business more of judging what are religious views and what aren't religious views, especially considering that we are a more religiously plural country now, and concerns about court involvement in those things, and perhaps it would be better for there to be equal application of secularism across the board in order to protect minority religions from judges who might not even be familiar with their tenets or beliefs.
So these are my thoughts, and again, I am not an academic expert the way Professor, I litigate these cases. So it's more like how does this work when you're in the courtroom? I would say like a definition of religion is has not been like, man, we can't define religion, so what exactly are we doing here? Where the only thing like that comes up is when there's something questionable about the sincerity. So like Bob sets up the Church of Bob and donates all his money to it and then claims a tax exemption. I'm not even sure if you're in taxation, whether that would even work. And you say, look, wait, are you really a sincere adherent to the tenets of the Church of Bob, or is it a tax dodge? So it's more like that. Now, if there is, I think if there's sort of like, there's, maybe like this this hypothetical teacher who's really into the military and the National Guard and stuff like this, how do you protect people like that? I think it might have to be by legislation, but one undeveloped, this is just a thought that I have, is the constitutional doctrine of the captive audience. And it's it's kind of a first cousin to compelled speech. But like if they don't force you to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but they just have you, just listen to a diatribe by somebody like that. The Supreme or the courts have usually, until very recently, the captive audience doctrine was usually used by the government to censor somebody's speech, and they justified by pointing to this third-party captive audience that they were trying to protect. But if the captive audience people are really bringing it, saying the government's forcing us to listen to a message and we can't escape it, I think that's sort of an unexplored constitutional land that might be something where the military teacher might violate that, or that sort of kind of a secular establishment clause. But that's just my thoughts. There might be holes in that, but that's my thinking right now.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Professor Case, Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you. This was great.